Chapter 14. Dawn hung above the sweeping ridges and peaks of the dragon's teeth with a cold grey determination that was neither cheerful nor welcome. The warmth and brightness of the rising sun was entirely screened away by low cloud banks and heavy mists that settled into the ominous heights and did not stir. The winds blew with vicious force over the barren rocks, whipping through canyons and craggy drops, across slopes and ridges, cutting into the scant vegetation and bending it close to the point of breaking, yet slipping through the mixture of clouds and mists with elusive quickness, leaving it unexplainably and strangely motionless. The sound of the wind was like the deep roar of the ocean breaking on an open beach, heavy and rolling, blanketing the empty peaks in a peculiar drone that, when one had been enveloped for a while, created its own level of silence. Birds rose and fell with the wind, their cries scattered and muffled. There were few animals at this height, isolated herds of a particular tough breed of mountain goat and small furry mice that inhabited the innermost recesses of the rocks. The air was more than chill. It was bitterly cold. Snow covered the upper reaches of the dragon's teeth, and changes in the seasons had little effect at this altitude on a temperature that seldom reached 30 degrees. These were treacherous mountains, vast, towering, and incredibly massive. On this morning they seemed shrouded with a strange expectancy, and the 8 men who comprised the little company from Colhaven could not ignore the feeling of uneasiness that preoccupied their thoughts as they trudged deeper into the cold and grey. It was more than the disturbing prophecy of Bremen, or even the knowledge that they would soon attempt to pass through the forbidden hall of kings. Something was waiting for them, something that had patience and cunning, a life force that lay hidden in the barren, rocky terrain they were passing through, filled with vindictive hatred of them, watching as they struggled deeper into the giant mountains that shut away the ancient kingdom of Paranor. They trudged northward in a ragged line, strung out against the misty skyline, their bodies wrapped tightly in woolen cloaks for protection against the cold. Their faces were bent before the wind. The slopes and canyons were covered with loose rock and split by hidden crevices that made the footing extremely hazardous. More than once a member of the little band went down in a shower of loose rock and dirt, but still the thing concealed in the land chose not to show itself, content merely to let its presence be known and to wait for the effect of that knowledge to wear away at the resistance of the 8 men. The hunters would then become the hunted. It did not take long. Doubt began to gnaw quietly, persistently at their tired minds, doubts that rose phantom-like from the fears and secrets the men concealed deep within. Locked away from each other by the cold and the roar of the rising wind, each man was cut off from his companions, and the inability to communicate only heightened the growing feeling of uneasiness. Only Hendel was immune. His taciturn, solitary nature had hardened him against self-doubt, and his harrowing escape from the maddened gnomes in the Pass of Jade had drained him, at least temporarily, of any fear of death. He had come close to dying, so close that in the end only instinct had saved him. The gnomes had come at him from every direction, swarming up the slope in reckless disregard, enraged to the point where only bloodshed would quiet their hatred. He had been quick, slipping back into the fringes of the wolfscape, motionless in the brush, cooling, letting the gnomes overextend themselves until one had come within reach. It had taken only seconds to stun the unsuspecting hunter, to cloak his captive in his own distinctive dwarf habit, and then yell for assistance. In the darkness flushed with excitement of the hunt, the gnomes were unable to recognize anything except the cloak. They tore their own brother to pieces without realizing it. Hendel had stayed hidden and slipped through the pass the following day. He had survived once again. The Valmen and the elves did not possess Handel's strong sense of self-reliance. The prophecy of the Shade of Bremen had left them stunned. The words seemed to repeat themselves over and over in the howl of the mountains. One of them was going to die. Oh, the words of the prophecy had phrased it differently than that. But the implication was unmistakable. It was a bitter prospect to face, and none of them could really accept it. Somehow they would find a way to prove the prediction wrong. Far in the lead, his great frame bent against the driving force of the mountain winds, Elanon was mulling over the events that had transpired in the Valley of Shale. He considered, for the 100th time, his strange confrontation with the Shade of Bremen, the aged druid doomed to wander in limbo until the Warlock Lord was finally destroyed. Yet it was not the appearance of the driven wraith that so disturbed him now. It was the terrible knowledge which he carried, buried deep among his blackest truths. His foot struck a projecting rock, causing him to stumble slightly, and he fought to keep his balance. A wheeling hawk screamed shrilly in the greyness and shot down out of the sky over a distant ridge. The druid turned slightly as the thin line following struggled to keep pace. He had learned more from the Shade than the words of the prophecy, but he had not told the others, those who had trusted him, the whole truth. Yet, as he had not told them the whole story behind the legendary sword of Shannara, his deep-set eyes blazed within a fury at the predicament in which he had placed himself in, not telling them everything, and for a moment he even considered doing so. They had given him so much of themselves, and the giving had only begun. But a moment later, he wrenched the idea from his thoughts. Necessity was a higher god than truth. The greyness of dawn passed slowly into the greyness of midday, and the march into the dragon's teeth wore on. The ridges and slopes appeared and faded with a dreary sameness that created the impression in the minds of the labouring travellers that no progress was being made. Ahead, a vast towering line of peak rose bleakly against the misty northern horizon, and it appeared that they were moving directly into a wall of impenetrable stone. Then they entered a broad canyon which wound sharply downward into a narrow, twisting path that broke between two huge cliffs and faded into the heavy mist. Elanon led them into the swirling greyness as the horizon disappeared, and the wind died into silence. The silence was abrupt and unexpected, sounding almost like a soft whisper through the towering mass of rock, speaking in hushed, cautious words in the ears of the groping travellers. Then the path widened slightly, and the mist cleared to a faint haze, revealing a high, cavernous opening in the cliff face, where the winding passage ended. The entrance to the Hall of Kings. It was awesome, majestic, frightening. On either side of rectangular black entryway stood two monstrous stone statues, carved into the rock and rising well over 100 feet against the dark cliff face. The stone sentries had been fashioned in the shape of armour-clad warriors, standing watchfully in the deep gloom, hands gripping the pommels of huge swords, which rested blade downward at their feet. Their weathered, bearded faces were scarred by time and the wind, yet the eyes seemed almost alive, fixed carefully on the 8 mortals who stood at the threshold of the ancient hall they guarded. Above the great entryway, scrolled into the rock, 3 words of a language centuries old and long forgotten, served as a warning to those who would enter that this was the tomb of the dead. Beyond the vast opening, all was blackness and silence. Elanon gathered them closely around him. Years before the first war of the races, a cult of men, whose origins had been lost in time, served as priests for the gods of death. Within these caverns, they buried the monarchs of the four lands, along with their families, servants, favorite possessions, and much of their wealth. The legend grew that only the dead could survive within these chambers, and only the priests were permitted to see that the dead rulers were interred. All others who entered were never seen again. In time, the cult died out, but the evil instilled in the Hall of Kings continues to exist, blindly to serve the priests whose bones had years before returned to the earth. Few men have ever passed. He caught himself, seeing in the eyes of his listeners the unasked question. I have been through the Hall of Kings. I learned from this age, and now you. I am a druid, the last to walk this earth. Like Bremen, like Bronar before me, I have studied the black arts, and I am a sorcerer. I do not possess the power of the Dark Lord, but I can get us safely through these caverns to the other side of the dragon's teeth. And then Belenor's question came softly out of the mist. A narrow cliff trail, men call the Dragon's Crest, leads downwards out of the mountains. Once there, we will be within sight of Paranor. There was a long, awkward silence. Eleanor knew what they were thinking. Disregarding her, he continued. Beyond this entrance, there are a number of passages and chambers, a maze to one who does not know the way. Some of these are dangerous, some are not. Soon after we enter, we will reach the tunnel of the Sphinxes, giant statues like these centuries, but carved as half man, half beast. If you look into their eyes, you will be turned to stone, instantly. So you must be blindfolded. In addition, you will be roped to one another. You must concentrate on me. Think only of me. For their will, their mental command is strong, and enough to force you to tear off the blindfold and gaze into their eyes. The 7 men looked at one another doubtfully. Already they were beginning to question the soundness of this whole approach. Once past the Sphinxes, there are several harmless passages leading to the corridor of the winds, a tunnel inhabited by invisible beings called banshees, after the legendary astral spirits. There are no more voices, but those voices will drive mortal men insane. Your ears will be bound for protection, but again, the important thing for you to do is to concentrate on me. Let my mind blanket yours to prevent it from receiving the full force of those voices. You must relax. Do not fight me. Do you understand? He counted 7 barely perceptible nods. Once beyond the corridor of the winds, we will be in the tomb of the kings. Then there will be only one more obstacle. He stopped talking. His eyes turned wearily to the cavern entrance. For a moment it seemed he might finish the sentence, but instead he motioned them toward the dark entryway. They stood uneasily between the stone giants, the grey mist clouding the high cliff walls surrounding them, the black, yawning opening before them, waiting like the open maw of some great beast of prey. Eleanor produced a number of wide cloth strips and gave one to each man. Utilizing a heavy length of climbing rope, the little group bound themselves to one another. The sure-footed Durin taking the lead position, the Prince of Callahorn again assuming his post as rear guard. The blindfolds were securely fastened in place, and hands were joined to form a chain. A moment later, the line moved cautiously through the entrance to the Hall of Kings. There was a deep, hushed stillness in the cavern, magnified by the sudden dying of the wind and the echoing of their footfalls along the rocky passageway. The tunnel floor was strangely smooth and level, but the cold that had settled into that aged stone from centuries of constant temperatures seeped quickly through their tense bodies and left them chill and shaking. No one spoke, each man trying to relax it. Eleanor led them carefully through a series of gently winding turns. In the middle of the groping line, Shay felt Flick's hand grip his own, tightly in the blackness that surrounded them. They had drawn closer to each other since their flight from the Vale, bound now by ties of experiences shared more than by kinship. Whatever happened to them, Shay felt they would never lose that closeness, nor would he forget what Minion had done for him. He thought about the Prince of Lee for a moment and found himself smiling. The Highlander had changed so much during the past few days that he was almost a different person. The old Minion was still in evidence, but there was a new dimension to him that Shay found difficult to define. But then all of them, Minion, Flick, and himself, had changed in little ways that could not be readily detected until each man was considered as a whole. He wondered if Eleanor had seen the changes in him. Eleanor, who had always treated him somehow as less than a man, more a boy. They came to an unsteady halt, and in the deep silence that followed, the commanding voice of the Druid leader whispered soundlessly in the mind of each man. "Remember my warning. Let your thoughts turn to me. Concentrate only on me." Then the line moved forward, the booted feet echoing hollowly in the cavern floor. Immediately the blindfolded men could sense the presence of something waiting ahead of them, watching silently, patiently. The seconds flitted away as the company moved deeper into the cavern. The men became aware of huge still forms rising up on either side, images carved of stone with faces that were human, but attached to crowded bodies of indescribable beasts. The Sphinxes in their minds. The men could see those eyes, burning past the fading image of Eleanor. They began to feel the strain of trying to concentrate on the giant druid. The insistent will of the stone monsters pushed into their brains, weaving and tangling into their scattered thoughts, working tenaciously toward the moment when human eyes would meet their own lifeless gaze. Each man began to feel a rapidly growing urge to rip away the restraining cloth which shackled his sight, to strip away the darkness and gaze freely on the wondrous creatures staring silently down on him. But just when it seemed that the probing whisper of the Sphinxes must at last break through, the warning resolve of the beleaguered men and draw their thoughts completely away from the fading image of Eleanor, his iron thought cut through to them with the sharpness of a knife, soundlessly calling to them, "Think of me." Their minds obeyed instinctively, wrenching free from the almost overpowering urge to gaze upward into the watching stone faces. The strange battle wore on without respite as the line of men, sweating and breathing harshly in the stillness, groped its way through the tangled maze of unseen images, bound together by the rope about their waists, the chain of tightly clenched hands, and the commanding voice of Eleanor. No one lost his grip. The druid led them steadily down the row of sphinxes, his own eyes locked onto the cavern floor, his indomitable will fighting to hold the mind of his sightless charges. Then at last the faces of the stone creatures began to fade and fall away, leaving the mortals alone in the silence and darkness. They kept moving, winding through a long series of twisting passages. Then once again the line stopped, and Eleanor's low voice cut through the blackness, ordering them to remove the blindfold. They did so hesitantly, and found themselves in a narrow tunnel, where the rough stone gave off a peculiar greenish light. Their drawn faces bathed in the strange glow. The men glanced quickly at one another to reassure themselves that they were all present. The dark figure of the druid passed noisily down the line, testing the rope that bound their waists and warning them that the corridor of the winds still lay ahead, stuffing bits of cloth in their ears and binding them with the loose blindfolds to mask the sounds of the invisible beings. Al-Anon had named them banshees. The men joined hands once more. The line wound slowly through the faint green light of the narrow tunnel, their footsteps barely perceptible to their tightly covered ears. The section of the caverns ran for more than a mile, then faded abruptly as the passage widened and grew into a towering corridor that was totally black. The rock walls drew away and the ceiling rose until both had disappeared altogether, leaving the company alone in a strange limbo of darkness, where only the smooth cavern floor offered any reassurance that the earth had not dissolved entirely. Al-Anon led them into the blackness, showing no signs of hesitancy. Then abruptly, the sound began. Its incredible fury caught them completely unprepared, and for a moment there was panic. The initial shock grew to an enormous roar, like the sound of 1,000 winds combined in a fury and biting force. But beneath this was a horrifying cry of souls screaming in anguish, voices scraping and twisting their tortured way through all the imaginable horrors of inhumanity and utter despair of any hope for salvation. The roar climbed to a shriek, reaching a pitch so far beyond the comprehension of the mortals' stunned minds that their sanity began to break apart. The terrible sound washed over them, mirroring their own growing despair, driving relentlessly inward and stripping away the tattered nerve ends like layers of skin until the very bone was laid bare. It had taken only an instant. In another instant they would have been lost, but for the second time the hopelessly numbed humans were saved this time from complete madness as the powerful will of Al-Anon broke through the crazed sounds to cloak them with protective reassurances. The screams and the roar seemed to lessen and fade into a strange buzzing as the grim, dark face projected itself into the 7 feverish minds, and the iron thought spoke soothingly, commandingly. Let your minds relax. Think only of me. The men stumbled mechanically through the heavy darkness of the tunnel, their minds groping at the safety line of coherence and calm that the druid held out to them. The walls of the corridor reverberated with the still audible shrieks, and the massive stone of the cavern rumbled frighteningly. One final time the voices of the banshees rose in feverish pitch, screeching violently in a desperate effort to break through the subconscious wall erected by the druid's powerful mind. But the wall would not yield, and the power of the voices spent itself and faded into a deathly whisper. A moment later the passageway narrowed once more, and the company was clear of the corridor of the wind. Visibly shaken, their faces streaked with sweat, the men stood dumbly as Al-Anon brought the line to a halt. Shaking their scattered thoughts into some semblance of order, they removed the rope about their waists and the cloth binding their ears. They were in a small cave facing toward 2 huge stone doors, laced by iron bindings. The rock walls around them emitted the same peculiar greenish light. Al-Anon waited patiently until everyone had fully recovered, then beckoned them forward. He paused before the stone portal with only a slight shove from the lean hand. The massive doors swung silently open. The druid's deep voice was only a whisper in the stillness. The Hall of Kings. For over 1,000 years, none but Al-Anon had entered the forbidden tomb. All that time it had remained otherwise undisturbed. A mammoth circular cavern, the great walls smoothed and polished, the ceiling shimmering in a green glow, similar to that reflected by the tunnel they had already passed through. Along the circular wall of the giant rotunda, standing with the same proud defiance they presumably had exhibited in life, were stone statues of the dead rulers, each facing toward the centre of the chamber, and the strange altar that rose upward in the shape of a coiled serpent. Before each statue was piled the wealth of the dead, casts and trunks of precious metal, and jewels, furs, weapons, all the favourite possessions of the deceased. In the walls immediately behind each statue were the sealed rectangular openings in which rested the remains of the dead. Kings, their families, their servants. Inscriptions above the sealed crypts gave the history of the rulers interred there, frequently in languages unfamiliar to any of the wandering members of the company. The entire chamber was bathed in the deep green light. The metal and stone seemed to absorb the colour. Dust covered everything. A deep rock powder that had settled over the centuries and now rose in small clouds as the footsteps of the man disturbed its long rest. For over 1,000 years no one had violated the peace of this ancient chamber. No one had tampered with its secret, nor attempted to unlock the doors that guarded the dead and their possessions. No one but Al-Anon. And now Shay shivered violently, unexplainably. He shouldn't be here. He could feel a small, distant voice telling him he shouldn't be here. It wasn't that the Hall of Kings was scared or sacred or forbidden, but it was a tomb. It was a tomb for the ancient dead. There was no place for the living. Something gripped him, and with a start he realized it was Al-Anon's hand touching his shoulder. The druid frowned darkly at him, then called softly to the others. They huddled silently in the greenish light as he addressed them in hushed tones. Through those doors at the far end of the hall is the assembly. He directed their gaze to the other end of the rotunda, where a second set of huge stone doors stood closed. A wide set of stone stairs leads downward to a long pool, fed by a spring, somewhere deep beneath the mountain. At the foot of the stairs, directly before the pool, stands the pier of the dead, where the monarchs buried here lay in state for a certain number of days, depending on their rank and wealth, presumably so that their souls could escape to the life beyond. We must pass through that chamber in order to reach the passageway that will take us to the Dragon's Crest on the other side of the mountains. He paused and breathed deeply. When I travelled through these caverns before, I was able to hide myself from the eyes of the creatures put here to destroy intruders. I cannot do this for you. There is something in the assembly, something whose power may prove to be greater than my own. Though it could not sense my presence, I was conscious of it hidden beneath the deep waters of the pool. Below the stairs, to either side of the pool, are narrow walkways leading to the other end of the chamber and the opening to the passages beyond. These walkways are the only way past the pool. Whatever it is that guards the pier of the dead will strike at us there. When we get into the room, Balinor, Minion, and I will move on to the walkway to the left. That should draw the creature out from its hiding place. When we are attacked, Henna will take the rest of you along the right walkway through the opening at the far end. Don't stop until you reach the Dragon's Crest. Do you understand? They nodded slowly. Shay felt strangely trapped, but there was nothing to be gained by talking about it now. Al-Anon straightened to his full 7-foot height and grinned menacingly, his strong teeth gleaming. The little Valman felt a chill run through him that made him glad 10 times over he was not the enemy of the mystic. In one effortless motion, Balinor drew forth his great sword, the metal blade ringing sharply as it cleared the sheath. Henna was already moving across the hall, the heavy mace held tightly in one hand. Minion started to follow, then hesitated, gazing doubtfully at the stores of treasures heaped about the tomb. Would it hurt to take a few? The Valemen and elves were moving after Hendel and Balinor. Eleanor stood watching the Highlander, his long arms folded into the black cloak. Minion turned and looked questioningly at the mystic. "I wouldn't if I were you," the other warned him shortly. "It's all coated with a substance poisonous to the skin of living things. Touch it, and you will be dead in less than a minute." Minion stared at him incredulously for a moment, shot a quick glance back at the treasure, then shook his head resignedly. He was halfway across the chamber when, on sudden inspiration, he whipped out 2 long black arrows and walked over to an open chest of gold pieces. Carefully he rubbed the tips in the precious metal, making certain that his hands did not touch anything but the feathered ends. Grinning with perverse satisfaction, he joined the others across the room. Whatever waited beyond the stone doors was going to be given the opportunity to test its resistance to this poison that would supposedly kill any living creature. In a tight cluster, the company gathered around Eleanor, their metal weapons glinting coldly. A stillness settled over the great room, broken only by the expectant breathing of the 8 men huddled about the closed doors. Shay glanced back just for a moment at the Hall of Kings. The tomb seemed undisturbed, save for the ragged trail of footprints in the dust leading across the chamber. A deep haze of this dust hung swirling in the greenish light, stirred by the intruder's footsteps, but settling slowly back to the ancient cavern floor. In time, all evidence of their passing would be erased as the tracks were covered over entirely. At Eleanor's touch, the stone portal swung open, and the company moved noiselessly into the assembly. They were on the high platform that ran forward into a wide alcove, and they descended in a series of broad stairs. The cavern beyond was enormous, a vast, towering cave that still exhibited the full, unaltered splendor of its rough, natural creation by nature's careful hands. From the high ceiling hung jagged stalactites, stones, icicles formed by water and mineral deposits over thousands of years. Beneath these sculptured stone spears lay a long rectangular pool of deep green water, the surface smooth and glass-like. When a single drop of water fell heavily from an overhanging stone projection, the placid surface rippled outward once and was still. The weary men moved forward to the edge of the platform and looked down on the high stone altar set at the foot of the stairs before the pool. Its ancient surface scarred and poked, and in places almost crumbling. The cavern was dimly lit by streaks of phosphorus that ran brokenly through its rocky wall, giving an eerie fluorescent glow to the ancient chamber. Slowly the men moved down the stairway, their eyes picking out a single word inscribed at the stone surface of the altar. A few knew its meaning, Volg, a word taken from the ancient gnome tongue. It meant death. Their footsteps reverberated in muffled echoes through the vast cavern. Nothing moved. Everything was shrouded in age and silence. On reaching the foot of the long stairway, they hesitated for a second, eyes fastened on the silent pool. Impatiently, Eleanor motioned Hendel and his charges to the right. Then, with Minion and Balinor following, he moved quickly onto the left walkway. A misstep now would prove fatal. From across the pool, Shay watched the 3 figures edge their way silently along the rough stone wall, keeping well to the rear of the open walkway. There was no movement in the placid water. They were about midway now, and Shay breathed for the first time. Then the still surface of the dark pool surged upward, and from out of the depths emerged a nightmare, serpentine in appearance. The loathsome monster seemed to fill the cavern, its slime-covered bulk rising skyward, shattering the ancient stalactites. And shriek of fury boomed through the assembly. The massive body twisted and flexed as it reared out of the water. Long front legs tipped with deadly hooked claws clutched the empty air, and the great jaws clashed sharply, grinding together the black and pointed teeth that lined the edges. The wide, staring eyes burned red amid a cluster of bump and stunted horns that covered the misshapen head. The entire bulk of the creature was covered with a reptilian skin that dripped with scum and waste that must have been carried from the netherworld's blackest pit. The mouth oozed venom that fell into the water and rose with faint traces of steam. The monstrous thing glared at the three humans in the walkway and hissed with unbridled hatred, jaws wide, screeching in anticipation of the kill. It attacked. Everyone reacted instantly. Minion Lee's great ashbow sounded in a staccato pings as the poisoned arrows flew with deadly accuracy, burying themselves deep with the unprotected inner flesh of the serpent's gaping mouth. The creature reared back in pain, and Balinor quickly seized the initiative, moved to the edge of the walkway. The giant borderman struck powerfully at the exposed forearm of the monster, but to his shock, the great sword only barely scratched the scaly hide. Glancing off the heavy coating of slime, the second forearm made a quick swipe at the attacker, missing by inches as he intended. The victim drove to one side. On the opposite walkway, Hendel made a rush for the open passageway at the far end of the pool, shoving the Velman and Elven brothers before him. But one of them triggered a hidden release, and a heavy stone slab collapsed in the opening, sealing off the escape route. In desperation, Hendel threw his powerful body against the stone barricade, but it refused to budge. The serpent had been attracted by the sound of the falling stone. Turning away from its battle with Minion and Balinor, it moved eagerly toward these smaller foes. They would have been the finish of it not for the quick reactions of the battle-hardened dwarf. Forgetting the stone slab and disregarding his own safety entirely, Hendel charged at the huge monster, bearing down on him, and drove the heavy iron mace directly into the closest burning eye. The weapon struck with such force that it smashed the glowing orb. The serpent reared upward in excruciating pain, crushing heavily into the jagged stalactite as it whipped its bulk from side to side. Deadly rock fragments showered the entire chamber. Flick went down with a sharp blow to the head. At the edge of the pool, Hendel was buried under a cascade of crumbling stone and lay motionless. The other three fell back against the blocked entryway as the massive attacker loomed above them. At last, Eleanor joined the unequal battle. Raising both arms, he extended his lean hands, and his fingers seemed to light up like small glowing balls. Streaks of blinding blue flame shot out of the tips and struck at the head of the raging creature. The force of this new attack completely stunned the unprepared serpent, who thrashed wildly above the boiling water of the pool, shrieking in pain and fury, moving quickly ahead on the walkway. The George struck a second time, the blue flames flashing against the head of the enraged beast, twisting it completely around. The second strike threw the great gold body backward against the cabin wall, where, thrashing in an uncontrollable frenzy, it jarred loose the stone slab that blocked the passageway out. Shay and the Elven brothers had barely managed to drag the unconscious Flick out of the way in time to avoid being crushed by the massive body. They heard the stone slab drop forward with an audible thud, and spying the open passage, yelled wildly to the other fighters. Balinor had re-attacked the writhing monster as it again came within reach, striking vainly for the head as it swung down at him. Still stunned by the force of Eleanor's bolt, Eleanor had his eyes fixed on the serpent, and only Minion saw what the others were yelling about and waved them madly toward the opening. The Alan Shay picked up the fallen Flick and carried him into the tunnel beyond. Turin started to follow, but then hesitated as he caught sight of the unconscious Hendel, still buried beneath the shattered stone rubble. Turning back, he rushed to the pool's edge, grasped the dwarf's limp arm and vainly attempted to pull him clear of the debris. "Get out!" roared Alanon, who had suddenly spotted the elf near the opening. Choosing this moment of distraction, the serpent struck back. With one mighty sweep of the clawed arm, it brushed Balinor aside, knocking him with the crushing force against the chamber wall. Minion leaped in front of the monster, but its sudden rush bowled the Prince of Lee over, and he was knocked from sight. The serpent, still in great pain from its multiple wounds, could think only of reaching the tall figure in the black robes and crushing the life out of him. The beast had one more weapon in its arsenal, and it used it now. The venom-tipped jaws gaped wide at the sight of intended victim, standing alone and unprotected. The great sheets of flame shot forth, completely encasing the druid. Durin, who was in position to see everything happening on the walkway, gave an audible gasp of dismay. Shay and Dale, standing just beyond the entrance of the tunnel leading from the assembly, watched in mute horror as the flames covered the tall mystic. But a second later the fire died, and Alanon stood untouched before the astonished lookers. His hands raised and the blue streaks of flame shot out of his extended fingers, striking the head of the serpent with terrific force, sending the scaled body reeling back once again. Steam rose in great clouds from the thrashing waters of the pool, mingling in a heavy mist with the dust and smoke stirred by the battle until everything was obscured from view. Then from out of the haze, Balinor appeared at Durin's side, his cloak torn and shredded, the shining chainmail chipped and battered, the familiar face streaked with sweat and blood. Together they pulled Hendel from beneath the rock. With the one great arm, the Prince of Callahorn lifted the silent form over his shoulder and motioned Durin ahead of him into the passage, where Dale and Shay still lingered with the unconscious Flick. The giant borderman ordered them to pick up the fallen Veilman, and without waiting to see if they obeyed, disappeared down the darkened corridor. Hendel over one shoulder, the great broadsword held tightly in his free hand. The elven brothers quickly did as they were told, but Shay hesitated, searching worriedly for some sign of minion. The assembly was a shambles, the long rows of stalactites smashed, the walkways a mass of rubble, the walls cracked and shattered, and everything obscured by dust and steam from the boiling pool. To one side of the cavern, the massive form of the serpent was still visible, thrashing in agony against the broken wall, its great bulk of writhing masses, scales and blood. Neither Minion nor Alanon was in view, but a moment later both appeared from out of the thick haze, Minion limping slightly, but still clutching their ash bow and the sword of Lee. Alanon's dark form tattered and laid with dust and ash. Without speaking, the druid waved the Veilman ahead of them. Together the three stumbled through the partially blocked opening. What happened after was vague in everyone's mind. Numbly the battered group hurried along the tunnel, carrying the two wounded and unconscious men. Time dragged agonizingly away. Then abruptly they were outside, blinking in the bright light of the afternoon sun, standing at the edge of the dangerously steep cliff face. To their right the dragon's crest wound its way downward to the open hill country below. Suddenly the whole mountain began to rumble menacingly, shaking in short tremors beneath their feet. With a sharp command, Alanon ordered them down the narrow trail. Balinor led the way, carrying the still form of Hendel. Minion Lee a couple of steps behind. Durin and Dale followed carrying Flick. Behind them came Shay, and finally Alanon. The sinister rumbling continued somewhere deep within the mountain. Slowly the little group moved along the narrow pathway. The trail wound unevenly amid jagged overhangs and sudden drops, and the men were forced to flatten themselves against the cliff face at regular intervals to avoid losing their balance and falling to the rocks hundreds of feet below. The Dragon's Crest was well named. The continual twists and turns in the path required concentrated skill and caution to navigate successfully, and the recurring tremors made the task doubly hazardous. They had progressed only a short distance along the treacherous pathway when a new sound became audible. A deep roar, that quickly drowned out the rumblings in the mountain. Shay, at last, in line with Eleanor, was unable to define the source of the roar until he was almost on top of its origin. Rounding a sharp cut in the side of the mountain which brought him onto a ledge facing northward, he discovered an enormous waterfall directly across from their position on the mountainside. Tons of cascading water crashed with a deafening roar into a great river hundreds of feet below that swept between the mountain ranges and poured into a series of rapids that ran eastward to the Rad Plains. The mighty river swept directly below the ledge on which he stood, and the narrow trail ahead, its white waters churning and slapping against the confining sides of the two peaks that hemmed it in. Shay looked at it for a moment and then hastened on down the trail at Eleanor's command. The rest of the company had gone a good distance ahead of them, and for a moment were lost from view in the rocks. Shay had gone about 100 feet past the ledge when a sudden tremor, more violent than the other, shook the mountain to its core. Without warning, the section of the trail on which he was standing broke away and slid steadily down the mountainside, carrying the hapless Valeman with it. He gave a cry of dismay, fighting to break his fall as he saw himself sliding toward a steep overhang, which dropped off sharply into a long, long fall to the raging river on the river floor. Eleanor rushed forward as the Valeman slid wildly in a cloud of dust and rock toward the waiting overhang. "Grab something!" roared the druid. "Cut yourself!" Shay clutched vainly, clawing at the sheer face of the cliff, and just at the edge of the drop-off caught himself on a projecting rock. He lay flat against the nearly vertical surface, not daring to try to climb back up, his arms nearly breaking from the exertion. "Hold on, Shay," Eleanor encouraged him. "I'll get a rope." "Do not move an inch," Eleanor called down the trail for the others, but whether they could have helped, Shay never discovered. As the druid shouted for assistance, a second tremor shook the mountain and jarred loose the unfortunate Valeman from his precarious perch, sending him sliding out beyond the overhang. Before he could even think to catch himself, arms and legs flying madly, he fell headlong into the swiftly flowing rivers of the river below. Eleanor watched helplessly as the Valeman struck with crushing force, bobbed to the surface, and was swept away, eastward toward the plains, tossing and turning in the boiling river like a small cork until he was lost from sight.